Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and I just watched episode 7 of season 2 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which is the crossover episode with Lower Decks. They released this episode early, and I think I can say it's probably the first episode of this entire show which I fully enjoyed, and I have almost no complaints. I do have a few small notes about some missed opportunities, things I would have added, but not really any complaints. And that's one of the things I personally like in Lower Decks is the attention to detail, that they do get all the continuity right, and so I personally appreciate attention to detail, and a lot of times they even try to bridge the gap and try to explain previous continuity mistakes or make a joke of them to make it more entertaining, to make it all worthwhile, and to even celebrate those mistakes to make something good out of it. And so I personally like Lower Decks. Not everything, there are some annoying things. I do think Mariner is a little bit too annoying most of the time, but other than that, I really enjoyed that show. But what they did in this episode made it even better. The fact they took the cartoon characters and turned them into live action, and it was done really well. And also, there were a lot of jokes in this episode which actually worked, which actually made me laugh. And the episode begins in the future, in the time of Lower Decks, and it's all a cartoon. And they discover a planet with a time portal on it, which I guess maybe the original idea was to use the Guardian of Forever, but it would have been a continuity mistake to have Pike and his crew learn about it before Kirk in TOS, and so that's why I guess they had to do it a different time portal. And we did have all kinds of versions of that idea in other Trek shows as well. There was an episode of Deep Space Nine in which they found a time portal which was similar to the Garden of Forever but also different. And so I don't have a problem with the idea that there are other technologies, other types of portals by other civilizations, but it's still a bit weird. How come when Spock saw the Garden of Forever with Kirk, he never mentioned to him that he saw something similar a few years previously? So maybe all these events of this episode were classified and he couldn't tell it to Kirk, I guess. And another issue is how come Starfleet just left it there on the planet after knowing what it can do? They just left it there unguarded, and I guess the excuse is that it can only be powered by a very specific material, which they said no longer exists anywhere in the quadrant, which was a little bit weird since they said it was part of the NX-01 class hull. So where did they get that material from initially? If it's so rare, why was it used in the hull of that starship? So that was kind of strange, and there's a scene when Spock tries to synthesize it and fails, and so I guess Starfleet decided it's no longer possible by anyone else in the whole galaxy to produce that material, and therefore it's safe to just leave the time portal on that planet. Why not take it to study, or at least guard it or something? So that's a small logical problem. And it's kind of funny how it looks like a distorted version of Stargate, maybe a combination of Stargate and that device from the movie Contact, which could teleport people across the galaxy. So anyway, they know that it's not working, and then they take a photo near it, and that somehow activates the device and teleports Boimler to the past, where he's no longer animated, he's now fully realistic. He even tells them, "You all look so realistic," before he passes out. And when we see the intro of the episode, it's all animated with the Enterprise, and what made me laugh was how that creature was sucking on the nacelle just like in the Lower Decks intro, so that made me laugh. Even when they arrived at that starbase, the creature was still on the nacelle, so that part was funny. And we also see the smiling space koala, which is something that was mentioned in Lower Decks as kind of a god creature in this universe, which looks like a smiling koala. And we also see the episode was directed by Jonathan Frakes, which is maybe one of the reasons it's so good, because he knows what he's doing. And Una shows Pike Boimler's badge, and it's also a communicator. And Pike seems surprised by that, but wasn't there a scene in Star Trek Discovery when he saw that Section 31 have the same kind of comm badges as the future ones, and so why is he so surprised here? Shouldn't he suspect that Boimler might be a Section 31 agent, since they were using those kinds of comm badges? And instead he just made a joke out of it, saying that flipping open the communicator is the most fun part and they don't have it and stuff like that. And then they meet Boimler, who wakes up and thinks he's in a holodeck, and tells the computer to end program, and then he touches Pike and then realizes it's all real, which also doesn't really make sense since the holodecks in his time are fully realistic, meaning you can touch the holograms and wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So how is touching Pike somehow proving to him that it's all real and not a holodeck? And I really like Boimler both in Lower Decks and in this episode. I like how here he's really like a fanboy, meeting his heroes and all of that. Almost like if a Trekkie was to come into the show. If I was beamed into the show and I was suddenly there, that's exactly how I would be behaving probably. And so that's something I really liked in this episode. The only missed opportunity is that I wish he would have said something about things not exactly looking like in the history books, something like that, to reference the fact that this show doesn't look like the TOS era, which was referenced many times in many episodes of Lower Decks, and so shouldn't he notice that there's some kind of strange difference suddenly, that things look really different to how he remembered them previously? If there was some kind of mention of that, or at least make a joke of it, or to try to bridge the continuity problem somehow, and yet they completely ignored that issue. And there's a funny moment when he sits on Pike's horse saddle and he says Riker as he's putting the leg over it to sit on it, so that was funny. And he did know Riker personally in Lower Decks, and so it would make sense in universe for him to make that comment, I guess. And the funniest part in this episode, in my opinion, were all the Spock moments. Apparently, after Spock hooked up with Nurse Chapel, it improved his mood so greatly that he's now actually smiling and telling jokes, and it completely freaks Boimler out because he's not expecting Spock to be that way. His reaction to Spock is the same as my complaints of all the previous episodes in which they constantly made Spock behave in the most un-Vulcan ways and almost all the time, and that was something that was annoying to me because it wasn't really that funny, and yet in this episode it is actually funny. I mean, the jokes themselves are funny, and Boimler's reactions to them is even funnier because it always freaks him out to see Spock apparently having emotions and a sense of humor and all of that, and all those parts were really funny in my opinion. The way that we see it from his perspective as something creepy, that Spock smiling kind of looks psychopathic and all of that. I wish they would have said something that maybe the effects of him being human an episode ago did not completely wear off yet, that he's not yet fully balanced with his Vulcan side or whatever, to somehow explain it and not just attribute it to his relationship with Nurse Chapel, even though I can't really blame him for smiling after being with her, I guess, and so it kind of makes sense. And the fact that they said that it's kind of like a phase, that maybe later on he'll be over it, and that way he'll become the true Spock that he's supposed to be, and all of that. So they kind of addressed those problems in this episode, the same kind of problems that I was having with this season. So Boimler's reactions and him saying that Spock should be the one that he knows in the history books, because that Spock is supposed to save the galaxy many times, and he's kind of freaked out because he thinks maybe it was him that caused the change, because at first he made him laugh, and then Spock started behaving like that, telling jokes and all of that. And the funniest joke when they were trying to synthesize that material I mentioned, and then Spock said it's very likely to cause a big explosion and said, "Do you feel lucky?" That really cracked me up. And Boimler was funny, and just seeing him as a fully realistic human in live action was really fun. I almost wish they would do a live action version of Lower Decks with these actors. Might actually work. After seeing this episode, I believe it could. And Boimler was kind of funny in this episode, in my opinion, and I think even people who have not seen Lower Decks will probably like it, because they can just imagine this is a guy from the future, and maybe they are a little bit strange from our point of view in the future. And later in the episode, Mariner also arrives from the future, and she is being herself, but it wasn't really annoying to me in this episode, because it was all kind of funny. And at some point she says the word profesh instead of profession, and it reminds me of a scene from a few episodes ago in this show, when someone said no presh. And I know some people are annoyed by this kind of dialogue, that it's all like modern sounding, like millennial vocabulary or whatever, but I personally don't mind the idea of shortening the language to make it more efficient. So if you want to shorten certain words, I personally don't have a problem with that. So it doesn't really bug me, and in some ways it makes sense that people from the future would talk a little bit differently. And there's also a running joke in this episode that not all Orions are pirates, and it's something they did address in many episodes of Lower Decks, since they have an Orion character on that show, Tandy, and it was often mentioned how not every Orion is a pirate, and so they play with the same idea in this episode, that there's an Orion science ship that Tandy told them about in the beginning, and Boimler tells it to Pike, who stands down weapons, and then that Orion science ship actually steals the time portal and runs away. So that was kind of funny to me, after all that setup of not stereotypically judging an entire race by their reputation of that, but in the end they do steal that time portal and run away, so they are still thieves in a way, Even though I guess it's not a Federation planet, so technically maybe it's not really stealing, so they're not really bad guys in the end. Those Orions really were scientists, but in that moment when they stole it and ran away, it was kind of funny. And that whole joke in general, it is something kind of modern, almost making fun of social justice warriors who always try not to offend anyone in any way. And yet the episode proves that that stereotype was actually true in some ways. And so it both has that correct message of not treating all the aliens as if they're all the same, but at the same time poking fun at the idea by showing that actually most of the time they are. And so it's kind of both educational and also kind of funny at the same time, kind of poking fun at itself as it's making that message. In the end, those Orions did turn out to be not so bad, and so they returned that portal in the end, which again begs the question, how come no one else ever went there to use it or to steal it or to study it, and it was completely forgotten about? I guess they should have said it was classified by everyone, including that Orion ship, but on the other hand, they talk about how history records who discovered it or not, and so it didn't really make sense. And also the whole part that it's powered by some material which used to be in the hull of the NX-01 Enterprise, which somehow no longer exists in the whole quadrant. And then they said something about how each ship which carries the name of the previous ship has a piece of it inside of it. And so I thought they're going to go on another spacewalk, since in the previous season there was a scene in which they showed that there was some kind of piece of the hull of the ship, which is the oldest unchanged piece of the hull. And so I thought they're going to go to the spacewalk again to take that piece, to use its material, since it comes from the NX-01. Instead, it's something under the floor in engineering. So that part didn't really make much sense. And why would no one be able to create that material or mine it anywhere in the whole quadrant, they said. And so it doesn't really make sense. I wish that part would have been explained better. How come no one else can use the time portal? And even if no one can use it, why wouldn't anyone want to study it? And there was an interesting scene when Boimler kind of tries to tell Pike that he should enjoy the years he has left because who knows how many he has, and then Pike just tells him that he knows about his fate and all of that, and then Mariner is surprised by that, and she starts kind of drawing the chair he will be in, around herself and kind of asking, so you know about the thing, and tries to show it with her hands. That part kind of made me laugh. And there's also a scene when Boimler talks with Nurse Chapel and tells him about why is Spock behaving so strangely. That's not the Spock that is supposed to save the galaxy in the future and all of that. And then she seemed really worried. So that was also interesting. So there were a lot of emotional, interesting character moments as well. It was not just all jokes. It was kind of interesting. But I do think the jokes is what made it the most entertaining episode of the season, in my opinion, because most of these jokes actually worked this time. Even with Spock, which is something that I was annoyed by in the whole season, but for the first time I kind of like what they are doing with Spock, because he was actually fun in this episode. His jokes were actually funny. I almost wish he would stay this way for longer, because he was actually really entertaining with his sense of humor, which I actually enjoyed. So that's all I really have to say about this episode for now. I think the next episode is going to be a musical, which I know sounds like a terrible idea, but since they managed to pull the idea of this episode so well, maybe they'll do that too, so I'll go with it with an open mind. Maybe it will be entertaining as well, maybe it will be worth it. It does sound like a jump the shark moment, like they ran out of ideas completely and are just doing silly things now, but as long as it's entertaining, I'm not going to complain about it if it actually makes me laugh. So that's all I have to say for now. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.